welcome. Welcome everybody to our lunchtime webinar today. Today we're looking at the practicalities of how to measure your church's carbon footprint. If you came along to our session this time last week, we did the big picture. Why do we measure? What do we measure? What's in scope? What's the national picture of the national church's carbon footprint? But today is all about the local church and how you can find out your own carbon footprint. And if you're joining us from a diocese, we're also going to hear a little bit about how it can help at a diocesan level. So if your church wants to know its carbon footprint, today we're going to tell you about the energy footprint tool, the information you need to have to hand, how to enter it. You'll then hear a little bit about the experience of Manchester Diocese in using the tool, and then we'll spend just a few minutes at the end. For those of you who are keen to go on and go further, we're going to tell you about the wider 360 carbon footprinting tool. So hopefully by the end, you'll have heard about how this information can help your parish, your diocese, and us in the national church to make our plans to achieve net zero carbon. You'll know I always begin with the preview of upcoming attractions, and we've got some really relevant webinars coming up over the next few weeks. There is one on February the 2nd on how to create a net zero carbon action plan. That could be at a diocesan level or at a local level. It's looking at the principles of how to create a plan. And then we've got sessions for schools, for dioceses, for churches, and for theological colleges on how they can look at becoming net zero carbon and what the overall route map has to say for those different types of building. And then a different kind of session on April the 20th, Preaching for God's World. This is about how to include the environment in your preaching. And there'll be an international panel of speakers talking about why we need to preach on creation care and give ideas on how to do it. There are going to be speakers from Brazil, Kenya, Polynesia, the UK, and the USA. So it's going to be a really, really interesting and very different webinar for us. It's not a webinar, it's a training day, but I just wanted to flag up as well that we've got training specifically on heat pumps coming up on the 30th of March and the 5th of October. I'll put links to all of these things in the chat when I've finished the introductions. Housekeeping today will be the usual, so we'll use the Q&A for your questions rather than the chat. So please do find the Q&A, that's where to put your question, and you can also do the thumbs up next to other people's questions if they've covered the same ground that you wanted to, and the questions with the most thumbs up will go to the top of the list. After the webinar, I'll send everybody the slides from today, and I'll also send any links from the chat. And I'm recording this session and it will be shared as usual through our website and also on the YouTube list. Right, most importantly, who are you hearing from today? We've got 3 speakers. Most of the time we'll be hearing from Tom Wood, who is from the National Research and Stats team, which is the team that has created and runs the energy footprint tool. And Tom will be giving you a live demo of the EFT so you can see how to use it. You'll then have a little bit of time from Matthew Barber-Rowell, the eco-transformation person from Manchester Diocese, and he's worked really actively with local churches to complete the EFT. And then you'll hear from Adrian Frost from Climate Stewards, who are the Christian offsetting charity behind the 360 Carbon tool. Right, let me stop sharing my slides. And Tom, I'm handing over to you first, if you are happy to get your live demo up, and we're all crossing our fingers that it works beautifully like it did in the test.
Yes, absolutely. So here we go. Now, is that working? Can you see my screen?
Perfect.
Great. Okay, so yes, my name is Tom Wood, and I am part of the National Statistics, part of the Research and Statistics Department at the NCIs. My role has previously been around developing the energy footprint tool and energy toolkit. And I'll show you today a live demo of the energy footprint tool. So if you navigate to your parish returns, if you log into parish return system, you'll be able to enter data for your return of parish finance, your statistics for mission, and your energy footprint tool. So we'll show you this one. Simply click enter your data once you're logged in. You'll be first shown this initial entry page, for which you'll be asked how many buildings you'd like to enter data for. For this demo, I'll show you how to enter data for one building. Potentially, if you had a church hall or another additional building, you can press add a building here and it will add an additional building. For each building you enter data for, you'll be asked to enter a building name. This is just to help you keep track of what building you enter data for. For this one, I'll type in main church. If you had an additional building, such as a church hall, you could enter church hall here. For each building, you'll be asked what sources of energy does the building use. You then need to tick which energy source your building uses. For this demo, we'll tick electricity and gas, just to keep things simple. You'll notice these other boxes. Oil is for churches that use oil. Alternative covers or various alternative heating technologies, such as heat pumps and combined heat and power. Solar is the box you tick if your building has solar panels. And other is the box you tick, which covers anything not listed here. So that would include LPG and biomass, so wood pellet boilers. If your church is a very old church that isn't connected to the national grid, doesn't have any gas heating, any oil heating, there is the option to tick no energy is used in this building. This is really useful for us to know, even if your church doesn't. So your church might be asked to fill out the energy footprint tool, even though they don't use any energy. If you do, if you are in that category, please do log in and tick that box, just because it lets us know that your church doesn't use any energy. So just for this demo, I'll just show you how to enter data for one building. So I'll remove that building. So when you press next, you go over to the next page. You'll be asked what the primary heating fuel is for the building. This is the heating fuel that mainly heats the building. So in this example, we'll say the building is heated by mains gas. If your building was heated by electric heaters, you could press electricity. If you ticked oil on the previous page, then oil would be an option to tick here. There is then a question on your electricity supplier. Now, these electricity suppliers here are ones that we've done a bit of due diligence around and we know provide genuinely renewable electricity. Some electricity suppliers will offer you a green tariff, but they don't actually purchase the electricity, green electricity directly from a wind farm or another renewable energy source. They simply purchase certificates that prove that an equivalent amount of green energy exists within the grid. Whereas these ones that we've got here genuinely do purchase the electricity directly from the renewable energy suppliers. So for this example, we'll tick other. If your energy supplier is not on this list, you can enter the name of the energy supplier in this box. We have this question, is your electricity tariff a green tariff? If you press yes, then we record that as a green tariff, and we use what you've ticked in this box, in this thing here, to calculate whether that's, sorry, I've just got the noise in the background. Sorry, Keela. Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. Where was I? Yes, so with this question on whether or not the electricity tariff is a green tariff or not, if you press yes and you've ticked one of these green electricity suppliers, we record that as green electricity. If you press another supplier and still tick yes, it's not counted against your carbon footprint, but it is recorded separately within the energy toolkit, and I'll show you that at the end. We then ask how much electricity was purchased. You've got the kilowatt hour figure, which will be on your energy bill. You may have to take several quarterly or monthly bills and add up the total figure for the year. But this figure will be on your energy bill. If you can't find it, you can enter your total spend of on electricity. It's preferable to enter the kilowatt hour figure because that gives us a more accurate result. But we have ways of estimating your kilowatt hour energy usage from your total spend on electricity if you don't have that the above figure to hand. If you do enter the cost of electricity, please enter it inclusive of any standing charges and VAT, etc., because we factor that in the calculations. So for this example, I'm going to put in a number. I'll put in 3,000 kilowatt hours. If your church has a mains gas supply, which we ticked in the earlier entry page, again, we have a list of pre-accredited gas suppliers. These are ones that supply genuinely renewable biogas. We have, as with the electricity question, we've got the box for other. I'll enter in another one here. Again, we have a similar question on is your gas tariff a green tariff? If you have pressed, if you've selected one of these suppliers and press yes, then we count that as renewable biogas, and we use the appropriate calculations. We use the appropriate conversion factors for that. If not, we treat it as an offset, which I'll show you at the end. Again, as with the electricity questions, you've got the volume of gas purchased or the cost of gas. We will enter a volume of gas purchased. When this figure will be on your bill, but do check which units it's listed on your bill. It's usually in kilowatt hours. Some providers might quote you in cubic meters or hundreds of cubic feet. So please do check which one of these is reported on your bill. Going on to the next page. Listen, Phil's, oh, that's fine. We have some optional questions. This question here is about work-related travel expenses claimed during the year. This is to get a sense of your church's carbon footprint from work-related travel. So if you've got any work-related travel claims you want to include in your carbon footprint, you press yes and enter the number of miles. We then have a section about that puts your energy, it's designed to put your church's energy use into context. So you don't need to fill out this question. You'll still get this section. You'll still get your carbon footprint without filling out this section. But if you do enter data into here, you'll get a sense of whether your church uses a little or a lot of energy for the size of the building and how much usage the building gets. So the first question is the building footprint in square meters. This will maybe pre-populated in your in your church's page on the EFT. We do have some data we hold centrally, and we've pre-populated the toolkit with that. It's blank in this one because I'm using a dummy church. But this may be pre-populated. If it's not pre-populated, then enter an approximate figure. These figures, the data in this section isn't collected for statistical purposes, so it doesn't need to be 100% accurate. So ballpark figures are fine here. So I'll enter just a figure here. We then have questions on usual Sunday attendance and usual weekday attendance. If you fill out your statistics for missions returns, this data will be pre-populated from what you've entered in statistics for missions. You don't have to enter it again. I'll put some numbers in here just to show you what happens. We then have a further question, just for a ballpark estimate of number of other church users who aren't attending Sunday and weekly services. So people like church community groups, classes, special services, casual visitors. Again, this doesn't have to be 100% accurate. It's just to give you a sense of whether or not your church uses a little or a lot of energy for the size of the building it is. So a ballpark figure is absolutely fine. I'll just put a number in here. And also the number of hours that the church is open in an average week. I'll put 20 in here. So this will then take you through to the results page. It will give you your gross carbon emissions in tons and your net carbon emissions in tons. So this the difference between gross and net is the gross is the amount of carbon your church has produced. Net carbon emissions will be factoring in things like whether or not your church is on a green tariff, whether or not whether you have solar panels and they're exporting to the grid. So your net CO2 emissions, if you have solar panels or you're on a green tariff, your net CO2 emissions should be lower than your gross CO2 emissions. We also have this section for renewables and offsetted, non-accredited. This is just keeping an account of when I showed you earlier, we had that list of pre-approved green tariff providers, and we said we were on a green tariff, but we weren't with one of those green providers. This will factor in the non-accredited renewables and offsets from those non-accredited green providers, but it won't be factored into your net carbon emissions because it's not accredited. We then have these energy efficiency bands to give you a sense of where your church ranks compared to other churches. So in this example I showed you today, we had a fairly average, this church's carbon footprint was average, it was in the 50th percentile. So around half the churches in England produce less carbon than this church, and around half of them produce more. When we factored in the size of the building, we got a very similar result. Sort of roughly half the churches produce less carbon than this church when you account for the building size, and roughly half produce more. We then, when I entered that data on church building uses, we then produce this band, which gives you a sense of how much energy your church uses for the number of people that use the building and how often it's open for. We put in quite a lot of people in that box. So this church is in the 0 to 10th percentile of once you adjust for the number of people that use the building. So considering the number of people that use the building, this church is actually using its energy very efficiently. And there we go. If you get to the bottom of this page and you need to change what you've entered, you can press enter data, that'll take you back to the start. Reset data entry will clear everything, and submit will close the form off and lock it for further editing. And there we go. That's a whistle-stop tour of the energy footprint tool. And so I'll now hand over to Matthew.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's very helpful seeing it live. Whilst Matthew and Adrian are speaking, you'll see there's quite a few questions have already come in, so you can be planning ahead your answers to those questions whilst the others speaking. Matthew, if I hand over to you now, can you tell us a little bit about the experience of using the EFT in Manchester Diocese and the benefits that it's brought to the diocese?
Sure, of course. So first of all, thank you for having me. I know that the webinar series are kind of a big hit, so thank you for including us in it. It kind of helped me to find my way into my role as Eco Transformation Officer in the Diocese of Manchester when I started last May. So I'll just give you a little bit of context for the Diocese of Manchester so you can relate what I'm saying to your own context. We've got 317 churches across the diocese, and we're going through a process, I think it's broadly completed now, of changing from 20 deaneries to 7 deaneries across the diocese. And we're kind of forming mission communities within each of those deaneries as well. So 33 mission communities, 4 or 5 churches in each, I think, is kind of roughly what we're doing. And so the focus is not just going parish by parish, but a conversation which is mission community based, and then relates to the deaneries and then back to diocesan level as well. So in terms of the team that I'm in, the transformation team, there is a transformation officer in each of the deaneries, and they work full-time with a full-time area dean in each of the deaneries. So the reason for setting that out is that was kind of the structure and the key teams that I've been working with on the eco work. So what we've been doing as of May last year when I started, the EFT was the first project that I took on. So what we looked at was how we could share the kind of the eco agenda and giving people a simple action that they could take on to raise the profile of the eco agenda as a whole. So we used the EFT for that purpose. So it was an opportunity to kind of get the word out. There are already things going on, but it was additional capacity that I was bringing to the eco work, and we're able to cascade via the deanery level, DTSOs and area deans and eco champions, where they were present in each of the mission communities. We're able to cascade information about what the EFT was, how it worked, and what we wanted to achieve during that window. So we have between the May and the end of July in order to kind of deliver. So I'll just kind of talk you through some of the elements that we use. So a little bit around comms, a little bit around sharing tips and measurements. And then what we did was we put the EFT in the wider context of the eco work that we wanted to do in the deanery, the diocese. And so I can talk you through the impact that that's had. So as I said, I started in May and the deadline was the July. So that gave us quite a short window. So pester power was actually quite a big part of what we did. Getting as much information, high volume of information at high frequency via a newsletter that I put out each week into the hands of the DTSOs, the area deans, and all other relevant parties, which was then cascaded to parishes. There are other resources as well. So the diocesan comms team were incredibly helpful at getting the word out. The energy footprint tool was a big part of what we wanted to do. And also local resources. So one of our eco champions in Alderman Ashton Deanery had developed something called the Eco Echo, which he'd been producing for the previous 18 months or so. He was sharing information about the EFT and other eco issues in their area via a newsletter that he'd generated to his network. So that was a really effective way, tapping into what's already going on in a way which can kind of make a difference to returns. So high frequency, high volume was what we wanted. But then in addition to that, it was providing spaces for people to gather to ask their own questions. That was a big part of the comms campaign. So there was a series of drop-in sessions across the June and July that I ran, which I think we got about 35 people attending those across the, sorry, I've got a fly near me. 35 people across those sessions attending to ask questions. People that we'd not heard from before. They weren't necessarily involved in the eco journey, but they'd heard about what was going on with the energy footprint tool. So one thing that we did through the drop-in sessions and through the information that we were sharing via our comms channels was sharing tips on kind of easy ways of developing the measurement and what that meant for parishes. So one example that we had was a mission community eco champion bought a measurement tool for the footprint of their church and went around their mission community. I think it was probably 15 churches that he engaged with in total and helped them to complete the measurement. So he brought the resource, I think it was £20 from Lidl, this measurement tool that he used. He engaged with lots of churches, helped them to troubleshoot local issues in a way which got the data to them. But once that data had been gathered, it doesn't need to be gathered again unless there's a substantial reworking of the church. So it was helping people to access what they needed so that they could kind of finish the form off themselves. We also had one of our eco champions have put together a video showing how the tool was used. So akin to what Tom's just done. And thank you, Tom, for doing the update, because I think we had a previous version of the EFT which we've been using, so we might steal your version now that you've talked us through it. But just sharing that video as widely as possible, so it put the tools in the hands of the people that would be completing the work. We were asking people in parishes and mission communities to work as teams as well. We were trying to take the emphasis off individuals and put it on teamwork. We had the kind of the mantra, teamwork makes the dream work. And in terms of what that meant for us, we'd also set an ambitious target. So in 2021, I think we had 26% returns overall, but 57% was our target for 2022. So that was more than doubling our returns. And in terms of the way that that worked for us, I was told it's unrealistic, don't worry if you don't hit it. But what we actually did was we galvanized people around this idea that doing small things can make a big difference. We ended up with returns of, I think it was 60% engagement. So we exceeded our target overall, 49% in terms of usable data. And I'll come to that in a moment. But what we'd done is we'd help people to see that there was something that they could do practically to engage with the eco journey via the energy footprint tool, and people responded well to that. So in terms of that disparity of numbers, 60% engagement, 49% accepted, and usable data, what we said was, don't worry about accuracy this time round. It's more important that you engage with the process. If we need to tweak accuracy later, that's fine, because people are already involved in the process. So we've seen a little bit of that in our returns, but we've got people involved in the conversation, and we've got people joining in with the energy footprint tool as part of the wider eco journey. So in terms of our wider context, there are a number of things that we're kind of trying to link the energy footprint tool to. We're not saying, please just do this next return for the diocese because we'd like it, please. We're trying to say this is a really, hopefully simple and accessible way of joining in the eco journey, and here are all the other ways in which that we can resource that journey. So EFT is our starting point, eco church as well, which we know about. We're also developing a kind of a local mission and growth tool called the Eco Stepping Stones. So the Diocese of Manchester has a stepping stones tool, Stepping Stones for Growth, which is free and available on the website. We're doing an eco update for that, so that the eco journey can flow through the life of the church, through that mission tool, and it can be used to grow, kind of the local church through mission communities and deaneries. Our Eco Champions network, we're putting resource and time into that, and our target is to have an eco champion in each mission community. So we're working with those people that have been already involved. I've mentioned two of them during what I've been saying. And then we also have our eco elective. So that's part of the lay training pathway, which allows us to deepen people's understanding and their engagement with care for creation and the eco journey as a whole, but give them the tools that they need to put that into action. And then one of the final thing, I think, Catherine, this is where you and I first connected on the eco stuff, was around eco, kind of green fundraising, and how these tools can help to develop the narrative and the purpose and the evidence base behind funding applications. And I think being able to link the kind of the simple data that we gather into a broader conversation about the health and well-being of the church as a whole, that's helped people to see why the EFT matters. So, and I see that Alison's, who is head of 7 communities in Diocese of Manchester, has just put a helpful link in the chat to some of the stuff that's on the diocesan website. So in terms of EFT, I think that's all I have to say. I'm open to questions.
Thank you so much, Matthew. It's really inspiring hearing how the EFT is sort of really linked in missionally in Manchester. I think that's what's so exciting about it. It's not just sort of seeing it as a measuring tool sitting over there, but seeing it as part of mission and part of something much, much broader. Adrian, if I turn to you now, there will be some people who will have looked at Tom's demo and gone, oh, that's too much. And there will be others who looked at it and went, that's not enough. We want to go further. And you're going to tell us, for those people that want to go further, how they can go further and using your 360Carbon tool. And also, I noticed there's already been a question about, can non-C of E churches use our energy footprint tool, to which the answer is no, but they can use 360Carbon. So Adrian, do you want to share your screen and tell us a little bit about the tool that you have on offer?
Hi, thank you very much for giving me a few minutes just to talk about 360Carbon. It's a tool created by Climate Stewards. We're a Christian offsetting charity based down in Somerset. We introduced 360Carbon for churches about 2 years ago now. It's we call it a collaborative carbon footprinting tool, open to churches. We actually also accommodate synagogues, small businesses and charities. And the aim is to give churches and other organisations a place to have a look at their carbon footprint, get involved in the kind of journey that Matthew's just been talking about. We want to provide a tool that is useful, so we're always very responsive to feedback. If you find something that doesn't make sense or doesn't look quite right, if you get in contact with us, you'll generally end up talking to me. So we cover a number of areas that go beyond the EFT. We do energy, and I'll come back to that in a second to talk briefly about how we work with the EFT. We cover travel. I've noticed there've been a few comments in the Q&A about how to account for travel. In 360 Carbon, you can look at both clergy travel and congregational travel, if that is of interest to you, in a number of different categories. For any churches that do any flying, you can take account of that. Food. One of the things we found interesting over the years of working on this particular tool is one of the ways to engage people is to think about the things that they can actually have an impact on. In most places, most members of a congregation aren't going to have much to say about the boiler, but they might have something to say about the food that is served at a service. We also cover expenditure. So based on church expenses, we can estimate carbon footprint for certain activities. And finally, taking account of waste and water. The 360 Carbon tool, particularly the energy section, integrates with the EFT. If you sign up for an account with 360 and add your church as a Church of England church, we will do a lookup on a website somewhere else to find out your church code, and then use that to query the EFT, which means that if you've already filled in your EFT for the year, we can pull in the energy data for your buildings straight into 360 Carbon, meaning you won't have to go and dig through all your bills yet again to try and complete this section. Once you've completed all of the different sections, all of which are incidentally optional, you can do as much or as little of 360 Carbon as you like. We will be presented with a brief summary of your carbon footprints, all the different areas with details of the emissions factors used to calculate your footprint, the emissions for each activity, and you can download and share that with other people to encourage them to get involved with your journey. And that really is a very brief overview of 360 Carbon. You can find us at that web address. As Matthew said, I'm also open to questions, and if you want to talk further with me, you can get in contact with me through the website. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, we've got a lot of questions. Some of them are quite quick technical questions, and others are more philosophical even. Tom, I can see you've already typed answers to some of them, so I'll just read through those, because otherwise people won't be able to see the responses.
Yeah.
There was a question: can other non-Anglican churches use the tool? So not the EFT, but yes, 360 Carbon that Adrian just told us about. Isn't it a bit confusing having boxes for both quantity of electricity, gas, and the amount spent? I think the idea is that people might know one but not the other, so it offers them a choice.
Yeah, that's true. And if you enter data into both of them, then the quantity will supersede the cost in terms of how we calculate the carbon footprint. It is actually useful if you enter data for both, though, because it does help us sort of calibrate our estimates of how much energy churches that only enter the cost data, what their quantity is. So entering both is actually helpful, but if you only enter one, the kilowatt hour one is the one that supersedes the cost.
Okay. I do need to calculate work-related travel by train, and you've answered, please enter the car mileage only.
Yeah.
Will the EFT result show each of 2 or more buildings separately? And I think your reply is it doesn't currently do this, but that it's a good idea.
Yes, I'd like to. I mean, I've changed roles now within the NCIs, but when someone does, when the new person starts, that's something I'll hand over to them as something we'd like to develop within the toolkit, because I think that would be very helpful for churches to be able to see that data broken down by building.
And then a question from Mike about who you expect the EFT to be completed by, or what's the most common?
Yeah, it's often done by treasurers simply because they've got access to the energy bills. But essentially, I wouldn't prescribe anyone in the church. It's really down to the church, individual churches, and how that church works as a church, if that makes sense. I'm not sitting here centrally saying, no, this must be filled out by the treasurer or the church warden or whoever. It's really, as long as that person's got access to the energy bills, that's the important thing. And who the church wants to delegate that to is really their own decision.
So if I remember rightly, on the finance returns, they have to enter their utility expenses anyway. So if you're sat down doing the finance returns and you've got the bills,
yes,
makes sense then to click into the EFT, right, and do the EFT at the same time.
Exactly, yes, that is a very efficient way of filling out the toolkit.
Matthew.
Just in terms of gathering that data and ensuring the EFT is completed, we found that it's helpful to appoint someone who's not necessarily the treasurer. We know that that's where the information comes from, but having another team member to kind of pick up the baton and drive it forward can actually be a real help to the treasurer. They've already got a lot on their plate, and we're trying to highlight that as a way of kind of encouraging that kind of action on the eco stuff. Sometimes it's the eco champion, and that's a separate designated role, and we're working on a kind of a job description for that as well. So it could be that parishes and mission communities and deaneries look more creatively. So that's to add what Tom was saying.
It's really interesting to hear. And then there were two questions I can see you've typed answers to about how you calculate the floor area. Is it net or gross? And what if you had 2 floors?
Yes. Yeah, please don't consider we prefer to have the external area. The reason for that is when we have churches that don't fill out the return, we often use the data we hold centrally on the floor area to estimate their carbon footprint. So if we only have the external areas from churches, we just get more consistent data that way, and we can then use this to try and estimate the carbon footprint for churches that don't fill out the toolkit. Whereas if you start entering multiple floors and calculating internal area, then it just goes a bit higgledy-piggledy, and it just becomes a bit less consistent. So external area is much better. And
then there was a question from Mike for oil heating. Are there green options and approved suppliers, which there aren't currently? And Adrian, I can see that you've already typed one answer to a question, which was, does it integrate the other way? So if somebody's done 360 Carbon, does it populate the EFT? To which the answer is not currently.
Yes, not at the moment, it doesn't.
Okay, right. So those are the ones that you had already typed answers to. I just didn't want them to get lost, because
yeah, of course,
it disappears off the list. Right. So now I'm going to look at them ordered by upvotes, and we'll see. So so everyone listening, if you've got a question, type it in the Q&A, but also you can do the thumbs up. And what I'm going to do is look at the ones with the most thumbs. So if you want to skim down the 19 questions that are in there at the moment, and if there's one similar to your question, please do vote that one up rather than adding another one, because I doubt we'll get through 19 questions. Right. So at the top, it says, last year, I talked to a number of churches who were apprehensive about submitting their EFT due to special circumstances. Examples where a church was being used as a vaccination centre and ongoing building projects. They were concerned that there wasn't anywhere to record these circumstances on the EFT. How would you advise them in these cases? What an interesting question.
Yeah.
I don't know, Tom or Matthew, whether you have a perspective on that.
I mean, the first thing we'd say is I'm not sure that would be a reason to be apprehensive. We're not. I mean, the purpose of this exercise is to measure the church's carbon footprint. It's not to kind of name and shame churches that have bigger carbon footprints than others. So in terms of those things, if that being used as a vaccination centre meant they had a bigger carbon footprint, I mean, that's fine, but that's just the reality. They have a big carbon footprint that year, but we're not going to sort of tell them off for having a bigger carbon footprint that year. I think also the question about the other that I've added about the other non-service visitors could be used to enter that data now. So that would provide a bit more context, and we now have that that, that percentile I showed you that would take into account whether or not the church uses a little or a lot of energy for the number of people that use the building. And if you've got lots of other people using the building, then that, for a vaccination centre, then that would be counted in that question. So yeah, that's my initial thoughts on that question. I don't know if Matthew, you've got anything to add.
Well, just that we had similar kind of queries during our process where people were concerned about being seen to be on the naughty step, that their carbon footprint was higher than others. But actually the reality is that the data is really helpful. If you've got a high carbon footprint, especially because your church is in regular use, that's a good thing. It's a good problem to have. In terms of local mission, that's great. So, and the third thing that we found is that if we've got that kind of higher kind of usage in a variety of churches across the diocese, we can network those churches. They've got more of a complex problem and they can be dealing with and developing complex solutions as well. And that's going to benefit all the other churches in the diocese as we kind of pass that information out. So please do fill the EFT in, because it gets valuable information. Not that anyone's going to tell you off. That's not the case. It's that actually we're going to be able to develop a more comprehensive solution to the eco issues in our context. So that's what we've tried to get out there.
Next question from Malcolm. This one's probably coming my way. How could we take account of carbon credits where we have a considerable number of trees in the church's surrounding graveyard absorbing carbon dioxide and a field opposite with many substantial oak trees? So land is currently out of scope of the Church of England's net zero carbon target. Last week we talked a lot about sort of scope, what was in scope, what was out of scope. So for today, I'll just say that land is currently out of scope. That doesn't mean those trees aren't wonderful, and that doesn't mean that we wouldn't encourage churches around the country to do all they can to be looking after their churchyard in a way where the trees and the shrubs and the soil are all absorbing as much carbon as they can. But we don't currently try and measure it, and we don't use it, therefore, to kind of balance out against the energy and gas usage in the building. Next question is a practical one for you, I think, Tom, although you might want to touch on this, Adrian, as well, for 360Carbon. Does buildings include vicarages, curates, homes and rectories?
The answer to that is no. The diocese have a tool which they use centrally to measure the carbon footprint from clergy housing. Please don't enter anything about clergy housing into the energy footprint tool, because all that happens is that we then have to strip that data out and discard it centrally. So as I said, the diocese have their own tool for doing that. So yeah.
And Adrian, if someone was going on to do 360Carbon, should they include other buildings for you?
Yeah, just to confuse the issue, yes, they can. I would say, I think if you want to be keeping kind of a comparison between EFT and 360Carbon, fill in 360Carbon on the same basis as you've done the EFT tool. If you want to include vicarages, other buildings, you're free to do so, but be aware that once you start doing that, you're not going to end up with the same result as you would with EFT.
Next question is from Philip that says, if you have a church and hall on the same site, joined together but under separate roofs with one gas and one electricity invoice, do we include everyone who comes into the building, not just people attending church? Sorry if I missed this at the start. I think I've answered the question correctly.
Yes, so if they're joined together under separate roofs but have one, so when you say one gas electricity invoice, does that mean I'm taking that to mean they're metered on the same meter, in which case for practical reasons you just treat it as one building, because that's much easier to do. You can't split out the energy. If by one invoice you mean you've got one provider but they bill you for 2 meters worth of buildings, then it makes more sense to enter the kilowatt hours of each building separately. In terms of people that come into the building, there is that section or that question on other building visitors who aren't coming for services, so just enter the figure into there.
This is a comment rather than a question. Surely with rocketing energy costs since 2022, use of costs is very misleading to calculate kilowatt hours, as some churches will have fixed price contracts and others variable. I think you sort of answered that, Tom, didn't you? That if they put in a quantity and a cost, then the quantity overall
quantity
cost. But if all you know is cost, then that's what they can use.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, volume is always more helpful to us than cost. Cost is really the backup option for churches that can't retrieve their volume figure. We are aware of the energy bill problem, and this could cause us a headache this year. But we'll be doing all the quality checking we need to do to try and mitigate that.
Next question is about work-related travel expenses. Does that include the yearly mileage of our ministry team? We share a rector with another parish. Now, the rule of thumb is any work-related transport related to the running of that church.
Yeah, I guess if the rector's covering more than one parish, the ideal thing would be to just enter their mileage under one church, and then we've accounted for it. Yeah, there are a couple of little things like that we need to think about how we can integrate the EFT a bit better to make it work for those sorts of structures. But for now, I think the answer would just be enter that against one of the churches in the parish.
Derek asks, when I enter data for a church and hall, our comparative percentile figure is subterranean. It becomes more reasonable when I take out the hall. Is everyone registering their other buildings? Could you have any way of telling how many churches are including their halls? I mean, we would like them all to, wouldn't we? But do we know if that is happening?
I think this goes back to what that previous question earlier about adding the feature to break the data down by church and church hall, which is something we'd like to develop. I think that's probably what's causing the issue here, is that it's treating it as one church building when it's really several church buildings. I can only say this is something we'd like to develop further to make that a bit more helpful for churches that are entering churches and church halls.
I think there's a bit of an implication from the way the question is written that I think they're worrying they're going to be judged.
Yeah.
And so if I can just repeat, that isn't what the EFT is used for. There's no one who sits judging churches. We're gathering information so that we know what our carbon footprint is at church level, at diocesan level, and nationally. Tom uses this data to create the National Church of England carbon footprint report so that we know where we are. And then when we know where we are, we know how to start taking action, how to prioritize action. But please don't feel, as you sit there completing the EFT, that someone's going to be judging you for having included your church hall, and that brings down your efficiency rating. The next question is from Mark, who says, is there a way of bringing churches together so that I can see the benefits footprint, or do I have to do this manually? So the diocese can access all of the information for their churches, can't they? Does that include by benefice?
We could break it down by benefice. I think, yeah, from the point of view of an individual church user, that'd be something you'd have to do manually at the moment. But again, this is something I'd like to develop further, is having that ability to where I think the EFT, as it currently stands, is designed for single churches. And I think there is a bit of work to be done around making it more useful for multi-church parishes and benefices. Something we'd like to work on in future.
Matthew, you were talking about having churches grouped in mission communities. Did you have an ability to do reporting for an individual mission community?
Sure. So each of the transformation team or each of the kind of deanery transformation officers kept a record of their deanery and what was going on. So obviously we had the CV portal as well. So we were talking about diocesan as a whole. I broke it down into deanery so we could have those conversations, and then each DTSO use their kind of deanery level data to look at parishes and mission communities. So it wasn't a formal process. It was just that they had their deanery's data to hand, and they could could look at it at that level of detail. The example I gave of one of our eco champions kind of working with his mission community, he knew which churches were in it, he knew what help was needed locally. So it wasn't a prescribed process, he just took the initiative, and that worked well. I think because the portal gives parish by parish, we're able to build up to the mission community footprint and then the deanery footprint as well.
The next question is back on travel. I didn't see any differentiation for size of car, whether hybrid, electric or eco. Wouldn't that make a difference? I mean, the answer to that is it does make a difference, but we're trying not to overcomplicate the EFT at the moment, I think. Is that about right?
Yeah, that was it. I mean, when we were rolling this out, the consultation that we had with dioceses suggested that churches wouldn't want to fill in something that's that detailed. If we get a lot of demand to, you know, to change it to something more complicated, we could. But I don't, that's not the sense I'm getting from feedback from the EFT so far.
I'd agree with Tom in terms of 360, because in 360 you can do travel, and there's a sort of a simple version which does basic cars, diesel, petrol, EV and the like, and then an even more advanced, complicated version which breaks down by fuel and size of vehicle. So far, about 2 churches have had a go at doing the advanced version with all the different vehicle sizes. Everyone else just kind of lumps it into the yep, we're all driving petrol cars, and they're about this big.
What I'm going to do, Tom, I'm going to read out the next question and then give you a second, because I think the easiest thing is if you can screen share the right screen whilst I answer the next question down the list. So Christine's question is, so I've calculated personnel for our church, but I can't figure out how to break it down into the fields on the form. So could you possibly find that screen again and show it to us whilst I answer the next question?
Yeah, of course I can.
So the next question says, does this methodology supersede the questionnaire published by Arosha? No. So the Arosha are the organisation behind EcoChurch. EcoChurch is wonderful and amazing, and we wished every church would become an EcoChurch. EcoChurch looks across the whole of the church's life. It looks at worship and teaching, it looks at buildings, it looks at land, it looks at global engagement, it looks at lifestyle. And under each of those, it's got really useful questions for you to think about what your church is already doing, what you could be doing. I think one of their questions is about, do you currently calculate your carbon footprint? And so if you do the EFT, you know, it's going to help you with your EcoChurch survey, but they're 2 different things that are answering 2 different questions. The EFT is a really specific thing saying, what is our carbon emission as a church? EcoChurch is much more holistic. I think, Matthew, you've really encouraged both in Manchester, haven't you?
We have, yeah. I mean, we've got the EcoChurch targets and we've got EFT targets, and we're trying to develop both. And I think if there's one thing that we can do, we encourage people to do the EFT. But we recognise, as you were just saying, that it fits within the broader EcoChurch conversation. So just in terms of our strategy, we've got EcoChurch webinars coming up next week and the week after, and we're launching the EFT, and so we'll be having that conversation in parallel. So.
Tom, have you got the right screen up to show us
yes.
about how we enter person hours?
I'll just share that. Yeah. So in terms of person hours, we did in older versions of the EFT, there was a figure called person hours, which involved asking churches to calculate the number of people that entered the church and the average amount of time that an average person spent in the church. And it was the feedback we got was it was very complicated and wasn't that helpful for the churches. So we've tried to simplify it. So what we have here is we have the usual Sunday attendance. That's pre-populated from your statistics for mission return. Usual weekday attendance, which is populated from your, populated from your statistics for mission return. And then a ballpark estimate of the number of other church users, such as attendees of church and community groups, classes, special services, casual visitors, etc. Sort of anyone that doesn't fit into those categories, basically, in a typical week. And we then, rather than trying to calculate the average amount of time each person spent in the building, because that was, I think, way too complicated for churches to actually do, we simply just estimate it by the number of hours the church is open for in a typical week. So if you've got this will give you a slightly different result from the old person hours formula. But the idea here is that these are figures that are easier for churches to estimate rather than the old person hours methodology. So I would enter these figures in and see what you get. It might not match your previous person hours calculations, but this is what has superseded it because it's easier for churches to work with, basically. Yeah, I think that answers your question. Let me know if it doesn't. Stop sharing. There we go.
Next thing is a comment rather than a question. It's just someone who hasn't found the EFT useful in their circumstance. So I'm sorry you haven't found it useful, Peter, but it's a comment rather than a question. So and they mention a diocesan energy efficiency review, and somebody has asked what follow that review. That might well be referring to the energy audit program. So if it is referring to the energy audit program, I will find the link off in the chat in a second. Right, what is the next question? Matthew, there's a question that says, is Eco Champion a generally recognised role in the Church of England or just Manchester? I think different dioceses have done it in different ways, but your model is Manchester specific?
I think that's fair. I mean, our environmental working group is clarifying a job description, which sounds probably more formal than it is, for our Eco Champions, and we're developing a network, one per mission community. So there may be some differences to other dioceses because of our diocesan structure, but in essence what we're talking about is people who are working locally on the eco agenda, who have certain kind of tools at their disposal, and that's kind of broadly how we're defining our Eco Champions. So
just found the details of the energy audits, so let me pop that in the chat whilst I've got it. Right.
Can I add one final point on that as well? Our Eco Champions invariably are lay leaders as well. We're trying to encourage non-ordained kind of leadership on this, because we recognise there's a big part of the sustainability around the eco agenda, and people living in their context long term. So.
Right, how are we doing? We've got 2 minutes to 1, so I might have one more question, given it's got 4 thumbs up and everything after that it's only got 1. Regarding splitting other users from weekly services, does choir practice count as weekly services rather than external users, i.e. do church-related meetings count as core users rather than other? On one level, Tom, I'm wondering, does it matter? As long as
No,
it's in there somewhere.
It doesn't. As I said, that section of the form is optional and it's not collected for statistical purposes, so it doesn't matter, and please don't overthink it too much. It's there to give the church a sense of whether they use a little or a lot of energy for the number of people that use the building. So as long as the number of people that use the building are in there somewhere, then they'll get an accurate, or as close as we can, an accurate figure there. As I said, we don't use those grades at the end to grade churches. We don't collect it statistically. It's just to give the church a sense of where their energy use fits in with other churches, to put their energy use in context.
Brilliant. I'm conscious there's still some questions open, but it is coming up on 1 o'clock and I always try and get us to land on time. So I'm sorry if your question hasn't been answered. Hopefully you've got the gist of things as we've gone along from other questions and answers. Tom, thank you so much. It's so useful seeing it done live. Tell us one more thing before we leave, Tom, which is, when is the energy footprint tool open for this year?
It's open now and it will be open until the 31st of July.
Lovely. And Adrian, is 360Carbon open all year round, or does yours have an open and closing time like the EFT?
All year round.
Lovely. And Matthew, I imagine your call to action is just do it.
Absolutely right. Take your time. You've got 6 months. Work as a team, but do it. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you all. Thank you to all of the panel for giving up your time to speak today. And thank you to everyone who's joined. Please do go on and do the energy footprint tool. It will help you as a church. It will help your diocese, and it really helps us nationally to know where we're at on our journey towards net zero carbon. So you're helping a lot of people when you sit down and do the EFT. Right, let me save the chat, and I will send everybody the Adrian, if you can let me have your slides. I'm just realizing, Tom, of course yours was a live demo, so I can't send your slides to people, but I'll send you the links from the chat. I'll send you Adrian's slides, and this session is being recorded and it'll be on our website in a few days' time. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and goodbye.